This arrogant HOA Karen thought she could abuse her power and fine my dog for barking. There was just one massive problem. She didn't realize I'm her new neighbor and an attorney specializing in HOA law. Wait until you see how I use the official bylaws to completely strip her of her power and get her kicked off the board permanently. Let's get into it. The notification arrived on a Tuesday, slipped into my mailbox with the passive-aggressive precision of a paper cut. Standard HOA letterhead, Willow Ridge Community Association stamped across the top in forest green ink. Below that, a formal complaint, case number WR 2024-137, alleging that my dog had been barking excessively between the hours of 6:00 a.m. and 10:00 p.m., creating a nuisance disturbance in violation of Community Covenant Section 8C, subsection 4. The complainant's name was redacted naturally because nothing says neighborhood unity quite like anonymous accusations. But the address of the offending property was crystal clear, 1847 Maple Court, my house, which I'd moved into exactly 9 days earlier. I'm Stephen Chen, attorney at law, specializing in property disputes and HOA litigation for the past 12 years. I've represented homeowners against predatory associations in 3 states, won landmark cases establishing precedent for reasonable covenant enforcement, and written amicus briefs that helped shape housing law. When I bought the house in Willow Ridge, I read every single page of the covenants, bylaws, and architectural guidelines. I knew exactly what I was getting into, or so I thought. What the paperwork didn't mention was Karen Whitmore, HOA president for the past 8 years and self-appointed guardian of property values. The dog in question is Biscuit, a 7-year-old golden retriever with exactly 3 personality traits: sleeping, eating, and loving every human he's ever encountered. He barks approximately twice per day, once when the mail carrier arrives, once when I come home from work. Each bark lasts roughly 2 seconds. I know this because I'm meticulous about details. It's what makes me good at my job. The idea that Biscuit had been creating an all-day disturbance was so absurd it would have been funny if it weren't printed on official letterhead with a threat of fines attached. The letter demanded I appear before the HOA board within 10 business days to address the violation or face an initial fine of $250, escalating to $100 per day if the nuisance continued. It was signed with a flourish, Karen Whitmore, President, Willow Ridge Community Association. I set the letter on my kitchen counter and scratched Biscuit behind the ears. He yawned, stretched, and went back to sleep on his bed in the corner. Some menace. I decided to do what any reasonable new neighbor would do and introduce myself to Karen directly. Her house was easy to find, the largest colonial on the block, painted an aggressive shade of cream with black shutters so perfectly aligned they looked photoshopped. The lawn was striped with military precision, every blade of grass exactly 2 inches tall. A discreet brass plaque beside the front door read Whitmore Residence S 2012. I rang the doorbell and waited. Karen answered wearing a lavender cardigan set and an expression that suggested I'd interrupted something very important. She was somewhere in her late 50s, hair shellacked into an immovable blonde helmet, lips pressed into a line so thin it might have been drawn with a ruler. Before I could introduce myself, she spoke. If you're selling something, we have a strict no solicitation policy posted at every entrance to the community. I'm afraid I'll have to report this to security. I smiled my best courtroom smile, the one that says I'm reasonable but don't test me. Actually, I'm your new neighbor, Stephen Chen, 1847 Maple Court. I wanted to introduce myself and discuss the complaint about my dog. Her eyes narrowed slightly, recalculating. Oh, Mr. Chen, yes, I'm aware of your recent purchase. I'm Karen Whitmore, HOA president. And it's not just a complaint, it's a formal violation notice. Your animal has been disturbing the peace of this community since the day you moved in. That's interesting, I said, keeping my tone light because Biscuit is the quietest dog I've ever owned. He barely barks at all. Perhaps there's been some confusion. There's no confusion. Multiple neighbors have reported the disturbance. The barking begins early in the morning and continues throughout the day. It's unacceptable. Multiple neighbors. I filed that away. Can you tell me which neighbors specifically? The complaints are confidential to protect the privacy of community members. But I assure you they're quite serious, I see. And have you personally heard Biscuit barking? Her pause was just a fraction too long. I don't need to personally verify every complaint to take appropriate action. That's what the board is for. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting with the architectural committee. The door closed with a decisive click. I walked back to my house, pulling out my phone to make a few calls. If Karen Whitmore wanted to play HOA enforcement games with an attorney who'd made a career out of dismantling abusive associations, she'd picked the wrong neighbor. Over the next week, I did my homework. I spoke with every neighbor on my street, introduced myself, asked casual questions about the neighborhood, the HOA, and yes, whether they'd heard any excessive barking. The responses were unanimous. Biscuit was a sweetheart, they'd barely heard him make a sound, and by the way, welcome to the neighborhood, sorry about Karen. That last part came up in every single conversation unprompted. Sorry about Karen, she's a bit intense. She takes the rules very seriously. She once fined the Johnsons $500 because their mailbox was the wrong shade of black. I also learned that Karen had filed 47 violation notices in the past year alone. Unauthorized patio furniture, improper holiday decorations, grass exceeding the 2.5-inch maximum, cars parked in driveways overnight, basketball hoops visible from the street. She patrolled the neighborhood every morning at 7:00 a.m. with a clipboard and a tape measure, documenting infractions with the dedication of a war crimes investigator. The piece that really caught my attention came from Tom Garcia, 3 houses down, a retired contractor who'd lived in Willow Ridge since it was built. He leaned against his truck and shook his head when I asked about Karen. She's been trying to force out anyone who doesn't fit her vision of the perfect neighborhood. Young families with kids, anyone who works from home, people with dogs. She wants Willow Ridge to be some kind of sterile showplace. Last year she tried to ban children's toys from front yards. Can you believe that? Toys in a family neighborhood. Has anyone ever challenged her? Plenty have tried. She buries them in fines and legal fees until they either comply or move. The HOA has a legal fund and she's not afraid to use it. Most people just give up. I smiled. That's unfortunate. The board hearing was scheduled for Thursday evening, 7:00 p.m. at the community center. I arrived 15 minutes early with a leather portfolio, a tablet, and Biscuit on a leash. The community center was a bland brick building with fluorescent lights and folding chairs, the kind of space that smelled like old coffee and budget meetings. Karen sat at a table in the front with 4 other board members, all of whom looked vaguely uncomfortable. When she saw me walk in with Biscuit, her expression could have curdled milk. Dogs are not permitted in community facilities, she announced. Service animals are permitted under the Fair Housing Act and the ADA, I replied smoothly. Biscuit is an emotional support animal. I have documentation. That was a small lie. Biscuit was not technically an emotional support animal, but I had a letter from my therapist that I'd obtained years ago for a different reason, and it was perfectly legitimate. Karen's jaw tightened, but she gestured to a chair. We'll allow it for today, but this is highly irregular. I sat down in the front row, Biscuit settling at my feet with a contented sigh. The hearing began with Karen reading the complaint into the record, her voice dripping with official importance. The resident at 1847 Maple Court has violated Community Covenant Section 8C, subsection 4 by allowing her dog to bark excessively and create a noise disturbance. Multiple complaints have been filed. Photographic evidence has been submitted showing the animal in the yard. This behavior is unacceptable and must cease immediately. She slid a folder across the table. I opened it. Inside were 3 photos of Biscuit, one lying in my backyard, one sitting on my front porch, one standing near my mailbox. In none of the photos was his mouth open. In none of them did he appear to be barking. I looked up. This is your evidence of excessive barking, photos of my dog existing. The photos establish the presence of the animal on the property, Karen said coldly. The barking has been reported by multiple residents. I'd like the names of those residents, please. As I've explained, complaints are confidential. I leaned back in my chair. Actually, under the Willow Ridge bylaws, which I've read in their entirety, any homeowner accused of a violation has the right to confront their accusers. It's in Article 7, Section 2. You can't levy fines based on anonymous complaints. One of the other board members, a nervous-looking man in his 60s, cleared his throat. She's right, Karen. The bylaws do say that. Karen's face flushed. The spirit of the rule is to protect the privacy of community members who come forward in good faith. The letter of the rule is what matters, I said, not the spirit. If you can't provide the names of the complainants, this hearing is invalid. There was a long, uncomfortable silence. Finally, Karen spoke through gritted teeth. Fine, I filed the complaints, all of them. I personally witnessed the disturbance. Interesting, what dates and times? She fumbled with her notes. Last Tuesday, approximately 8:00 a.m. Wednesday, around noon, Thursday evening. I pulled out my tablet and turned it to face the board. I have video footage from my home security system, time and date stamped, covering my entire property for the past 2 weeks. Would you like to review it? Karen's face went from flushed to pale. That won't be necessary. I think it will. I queued up the footage and played it on the tablet screen, volume up. The board members leaned in. For 3 solid minutes, the video showed Biscuit lying in the sun, sleeping, occasionally lifting his head to watch a bird. No barking, not a sound except wind and distant traffic. This is Tuesday at 8:00 a.m., I said. Here's Wednesday at noon. Here's Thursday evening. In none of this footage does Biscuit bark even once. In fact, I have 2 weeks of continuous footage. He barks exactly twice per day for approximately 2 seconds each time. I can compile a full report if the board requires it. The nervous board member spoke again. It seems like there may have been a misunderstanding. There's no misunderstanding, I said, my voice hardening. This is harassment. Ms. Whitmore filed a false complaint against me and my dog in an attempt to force compliance with her personal preferences, not actual covenant violations. That's an abuse of her position as HOA president. Karen stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is absurd. I was acting in the best interests of the community. Were you? Because I've spoken with every neighbor on my street. None of them filed complaints. None of them have heard excessive barking. In fact, they all told me the same thing. You have a pattern of filing frivolous violations to harass residents you don't approve of. That's slander. It's documented fact. I pulled out a printed spreadsheet. Here are the 47 violation notices you filed in the past year. Here are the outcomes. 31 were dismissed or overturned on appeal. Of the 16 that resulted in fines, 11 were for violations so minor they border on absurd. A mailbox one shade off from approved black. A garden gnome visible from the street. Christmas lights left up until January 2nd. I stood matching her energy. You're not protecting property values, Ms. Whitmore. You're weaponizing the HOA to bully people. And now you've targeted me, which was a mistake. The room was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. The other board members looked at each other, then at Karen, then at their hands. Finally, the nervous man spoke. I moved to dismiss the complaint against Mr. Chen. All in favor? 3 hands went up immediately. The 4th board member, an older woman who'd been silent the entire time, raised her hand slowly, eyes on Karen. Motion passes. The complaint is dismissed. Karen's hands were shaking. This isn't over. Actually, I said, gathering my things, it is, because here's what's going to happen next. I'm going to file a formal complaint against you for abuse of authority. I'm going to request a full audit of every violation notice you've filed in the past 3 years. And if I find a pattern of harassment, which I will, I'm going to recommend the board remove you from your position. You can't do that. I'm an attorney specializing in HOA litigation. This is literally what I do for a living. You picked the wrong neighbor to mess with. I walked out with Biscuit trotting beside me, tail wagging, blissfully unaware that he'd just been vindicated. Behind me, I heard raised voices, Karen's shrill protests, and the nervous board member saying something about needing to discuss this further. The next morning, I filed my formal complaint with the board, 23 pages fully documented, with witness statements from 8 neighbors detailing Karen's pattern of harassment. I also sent a courtesy copy to every homeowner in Willow Ridge via the community email list. By noon, my inbox was flooded with responses. Thank you for doing this. She fined us $800 last year for having a trampoline. Can you help us appeal? I've been documenting her behavior for 2 years. Do you want my records? The special board meeting was called for the following week. Karen showed up with her own attorney, a tired-looking man in a rumpled suit who spent most of the meeting trying to convince her to resign quietly. She refused. The board voted 4-0, with Karen abstaining, to remove her as president, effective immediately. They also voted to reverse 29 of her violation notices from the past year and refund the associated fines. Karen stood, trembling with rage. You've all made a terrible mistake. This community will fall apart without proper leadership. Property values will plummet. You'll be living in a slum within a year. The older woman who'd been silent at my hearing finally spoke. Karen, you've been terrorizing this neighborhood for 8 years. We're not going to miss you. The final touch came 2 months later when the board elected me as the new HOA president. I accepted on the condition that we rewrite the covenants to include protections against frivolous complaints and establish clear due process for violations. The vote was unanimous. Karen moved out 3 months after that, selling her house to a young family with 2 kids, a dog, and a trampoline. I saw her loading boxes into a moving truck one Saturday morning and walked over with Biscuit. She glared at me. I hope you're happy. You've destroyed everything I built. I didn't destroy anything, I said. I just made sure the HOA serves the community instead of your ego. There's a difference. She climbed into her truck without another word and drove away. I never saw her again. Biscuit and I walked back home, past neighbors washing cars, kids playing basketball, garden gnomes proudly displayed in flower beds. The neighborhood looked the same as it had when I moved in, but it felt different. Lighter, like someone had opened all the windows and let the fresh air in. That evening, I sat on my porch with a glass of wine, Biscuit sprawled at my feet, watching the sun set over Willow Ridge. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom Garcia. Thanks again for taking her down. You've made this place livable again. I scratched Biscuit's ears and smiled. Sometimes the best legal victories don't happen in courtrooms. Sometimes they happen in community centers with fluorescent lights and folding chairs, where one person with the right knowledge and the willingness to fight back can change everything. Biscuit barked once, a soft, happy sound, and went back to sleep. I raised my glass in a silent toast to quiet dogs, good neighbors, and HOA presidents who finally learned that rules are meant to serve people, not control them.